2025 open meeting of the Hopkinton Conservation Commission being conducted remotely, consistent with an act extending certain COVID-19 measures adopted during the state of emergency. The new law authorizes all members of a public body to continue participating in meetings remotely. The open meeting law's requirement that a quorum of the body and chair be physically present at the meeting location remains suspended. For this meeting, the Hopkinton Conservation Commission is convening by video conference via, what are we using today? Google Meet? I think so, via Google Meet, as posted on the town's web meeting calendar and the Conservation Commission agenda identifying how the public may join. Additionally, the meeting may also be broadcast by HCAM through one or many of its channels or platforms. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and that some attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that others may be able to see you, and take care not to screen share your computer. Anything that you broadcast may be captured by the recording. Please also keep yourself on mute unless and until called on by the chair. Supporting materials that have been provided to members of the commission for this meeting are available on the town's website. This meeting will feature public comment. After commission members and staff have discussed each project application on the agenda, the chair will open the discussion for public comment. Members of the public who wish to speak are asked to identify their name and address. 3 minutes will be afforded for each public comment. Each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted via roll call of the members. I will now confirm which commission members are present. Ed Harrow.
I am here.
Melissa Rykos.
Present.
Matt Moyen.
Present.
And now let's see here if anyone's shown up since I started reading. Jim Cirillo. Janine LeBlanc. Heather Burton. And I am Ted Barker Hook, and I am present. I will now confirm staff. Judy.
Present.
Anna.
Present.
And Joe Orzel of Lucas is probably not coming. All right, the meeting is officially opened. I don't have the agenda in front of me, but I think, Lucy, you are the agenda. So I'm going to pass the microphone to you.
Thank you, Ted. That is quite the spiel. So kudos to you. Thanks for walking through it.
It's all written in front of me. So
yeah, it's amazing. Well, we're really grateful. I'm joined by my colleague, Zoe, and we are appreciative of the time today. I know it's lunchtime, so please eat and take the, do whatever you need to do throughout this hour presentation. Fantastic, Ed, and discussion. We're really hoping for this to be a conversation. We'll start with the presentation, but the back half of the meeting is really meant to be a discussion that brings forward the knowledge and experience that you have serving on the Conservation Commission to help inform and refine and right-size the recommendations that we are making through our project. So look forward to that engagement and discussion, and really invite you all to be active participants in the conversation. I will introduce myself briefly, and then I think Zoe, my colleague, is here, and she can introduce herself as well, and appreciate that Julia Chun, who's helping steward this project for the town, is also present. So this is just a great team of folks who are coming together. My name's Lucy Perkins. I'm the Director of Climate Resilience for Seiler Climate Consulting. Our firm has actually been able and had the privilege of working with the town both on this project and also in the development of the Climate Action Plan. So I've had a great opportunity to get to know stakeholders, leaders, and priorities of community members there, and pull through some of those threads in the work that we're doing. My background is in local and state urban planning, and also bringing together some coastal management elements through a fellowship with NOAA, and really excited to be back in sort of the urban planning, local action area after I spent 4 years or so in municipal government here in Maine. With that, I'll pause, and I'm going to pass it to my colleague Zoe if you want to come off mute and just introduce yourself, and then I will start sharing a presentation and we can get in to the agenda in full.
Hi, everybody. I'm Zoe Fay. Nice to meet you virtually. Fun fact about Lucy and I is that we both came out of the Environmental Studies Department at Bates College in Maine, and came back around in our work together here. So we had many years apart, and then we've converged, which was really fun. I have been supporting with a lot of the kind of educational and community engagement elements of this. My background is in public education and inclusive practice. And so I am now going back to grad school for environmental focused urban planning. Oh my gosh! No way!
Hey, you're a bobcat. Look at that.
Actually, my wife and daughter. I am not.
Amazing.
I love that. And so, yes, I have been doing a lot of the kind of thinking around how to educate the community about these really important things that sometimes are not on people's radars, and how to weave in some of the anticipated kind of friction points or misconceptions around the work. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all, because I've kind of been deep in planning the agenda and the materials for the open house.
Thanks, Zoe. And we'll touch on both of those, these amazing materials that Zoe's developed as part of this project. And then the open house is sort of the next step that we'll introduce and invite you all to at the end of the presentation. So thanks for introducing yourself. Really glad you're here. Please jump in at any time that you feel is important, Zoe. I'm going to take a minute and just share my screen and then make sure with you all that you're seeing the right thing. So let's see. I haven't done this through Google Meet, so apologies.
There's a little button at the bottom. It's like a square with an arrow in it.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's like having some issues with the browser that I'm using. So I'm going to just get this set up over here. Thanks for your patience. Let's try this. And Ed, I appreciate that you mentioned that you had the resources. I know there was a wealth of information that we passed along ahead of time. And so if folks were able to engage with it, great. And also we'll dig through it as much as we can while we're together, and invite you all to take time outside of the conversation to explore a lot of the information that's there. Okay, how does this look?
See it.
Yay, great. All right, so just want to start. Some of you may have been introduced to this project through Judy or Julia, and others, it may be a new concept. We've actually had the fortune of working on it for several months, and it emerged out of the work that my colleague Peyton did with you all through the Climate Action Plan to identify some priority actions. And there is a desire to really look at and revisit and review regulations that the town uses and implements on a daily basis to try to identify where are the opportunities to integrate climate resilience into that work for a few different reasons. We'd heard of the awareness of impacts from flooding, and that a lot of the work to hold climate resilience currently happens in the stormwater regulations. So there was an interest to figure out, are there broader mechanisms in other bylaws and regulations that can be used to support that same purpose of integrating climate resilience into the town's land use policies? And then again, hearing recommendations from the Conservation Commission and also the Sustainable Green Committee to really do a thorough policy and bylaw review led us to the place where we've had the opportunity to actually dig into that that sort of charter, that prompt for the work, and start to learn and find some opportunities for improvement. So with that, during our time today, we have a couple meeting goals. The first main goal is to just share progress to date on the draft recommendations and the work we've been doing to even get there. A lot of the background research, analysis of best practices, and some initial conversations that we've had with other staff and community partners. And then where I hope you all will really bring in the knowledge and experience that you hold through your work on the commission, we'll discuss the draft priority recommendations that are really meant to integrate climate resilience into Hopkinton's land use policies, and have a couple sort of key discussion or framing questions that you can carry with you as we go through those recommendations to help identify gaps or areas for improvement as we refine and update and move towards a final draft of the report. So just to sort of walk us through, we're going to do a bit of a timeline of what we've covered so far, so you get a sense of what has been accomplished to date. So this work began actually with a core team kickoff meeting, and that core team is a meeting of municipal staff, including Judy and Anna and Julia, who are on our call today, as well as other staff from the planning department, public works department, and some folks at the state level who are partners to launch this project. And we used that meeting back in November of 2024, which feels like eons ago at this point, to identify guiding principles for the project. So these are broad strategic guidelines that will really direct how we will make decisions throughout the remaining parts of the project and key decision points along the way. It was a really robust discussion, and we'll return to those guiding principles later in the presentation so you can actually see how we use them in practice. After that core team meeting, we then looked at existing bylaws, especially in Massachusetts, and used a tool that's been created by Mass Audubon to assess how well Hopkinton's existing bylaws compare to what we might consider conventional, better, or best practice. And I'll just define those three characterizations for you all. Conventional meaning the existing bylaw or regulation is implementing sort of a common requirement. Better, describing a bylaw where an improvement from the common practices has been made. And a best practice is really a place where the town is already a leader or utilizing the ideal approach or strategy to implement this particular regulation or idea. So that was quite an extensive research. There's a really helpful table. It's available on the Mass Audubon website. Our sort of motive there was to use what has been put out already and implemented across communities as a good starting point to analyze and assess what exists in place in Hopkinton. Based on that research, I just want to walk you through some of the initial key findings that came from that type of analysis. There were three, and four. They're listed here on the screen. The first one is really around current bylaws and regulations encourage low impact development features in site plan and design requirements. The town's existing subdivision regulations and stormwater regulations promote the integration of LID measures to the maximum extent feasible and where adequate conditions allow. So it was nice to see where are things going well, what is the town currently doing in a better or best practice sense. Strong language is really rooted in an understanding of the impact of land development projects and other land use conversations can have on non-point source pollution, stormwater runoff rates and volumes, and instances and severity of flooding and public safety. So just already starting to take into account what are the things that need to be considered here to integrate climate resilience into existing policies. The second key finding is that existing practices also promote compliance with MS4 requirements. So the town already has many practices and programs in place related to stormwater management and pollution prevention. These can be sort of the regulatory control measures for construction site stormwater runoff or post-construction stormwater management. They're through the DEP stormwater management standards and small MS4 general permit requirements. And those really serve as a good floor for stormwater management criteria in new development. So thumbs up again. Key finding 3 was that there's flexibility in the materials and design of paved infrastructure that can reduce overall imperviousness. Current bylaws and regulations do not expressly incentivize new development to minimize impervious surfaces and maximize the potential for on-site infiltration. There are a number of examples that we identified through this work where this is the case in the draft report. And as a result, there were some alternative techniques that can be used to reduce imperviousness, and more on that in perhaps some of the recommendations that we can put forward. And then the fourth key finding was that improvements can be made to promote efficient compact development patterns. The town zoning bylaws maintain size and setback requirements across zoning districts to really facilitate predictable and consistent growth, and that makes a ton of sense. And there are opportunities to promote efficient compact development patterns, aware that some initial discussions to consider revisiting minimum lot sizes in order to facilitate infill development have already happened and need to do so in a way that don't lose community characteristics that feel so important to folks who are living in Hopkinton. So that was sort of our initial review. After that, we went out and started to look at what are some of the best practices that exist in the state with an understanding of where Hopkinton has an opportunity to do better, maybe move from conventional to better practice or better to best practice. Through that work, we reviewed a couple of resources. There's a great resource from National River Communities. Mass DEP has a review of all the municipal stormwater codes, and Pleasant Bay Alliance Regional Stormwater Management Bylaw Review did a really thorough exploration of some of the work there. So those were some helpful resources, many others, but they allowed us to start to identify case studies and exemplary language that exists across the state. After that, we started to pivot a bit and work on a couple different fronts. And Zoe helped us launch some public education materials that can really help build the understanding of and support for climate resilient land use practices among residents. Noticing a typo here, land use, not land use. The story map was, we first developed a story map to engage and educate community members. And then we also created a one-page, I'll just put them up on the screen right now. This is a one-pager about climate-smart native plants. They should both be available on the town website. They're really meant to be helpful guides, both to show an overview of the project itself, what we're hoping to achieve, what we're looking at and focusing on, but then what can you do if you might have land or property in Hopkinton, and what are some changes you can make or things to consider around climate-smart land use practices at home. So these are out there, and I think are a nice way to meet people where they are and engage them in the process and the conversation as we go along. Okay, so from here, once we had reviewed the existing bylaws, researched the best practices, started to develop these public educational materials, we then began to actually turn our attention to what are some preliminary recommendations that we can make to the town to increase the use of nature-based solutions, integrate climate resilience into land use policies based on sort of all the work we've done so far. And so we use this prioritization matrix, which I shared in my email last week, as a really helpful tool in sorting through all of the information that was out there and putting it in the context of goals for this project. So that tool itself, as I mentioned, is structured around 6 key goals, and each goal is then supported by a series of strategies. In developing those strategies, we were really compelled to consider how time and resource intensive the specific change or update could be, what approval would be required for the change to be adopted, and how the proposed strategy would benefit stormwater management, flood mitigation, smart growth, floodplain management, fiscal stewardship, and other co-benefits for ecologically healthy natural areas. So it was like a pretty thorough analysis of, if you change X, what happens and what is required in order to make that possible. It resulted in, if you've started to work through the spreadsheet, it has over 100 strategies for the town to consider. And that is a lot. So you'll see in the next step, we really tried to make sense of where do you start from here based on this now wealth of resources and ideas that have been pulled from and really adapted to the local context. So based on that really long matrix, we then have turned our attention to producing a draft report that includes findings of the analysis that I shared at the beginning and a list of preliminarily priority recommendations for the town to consider. And what I'll walk through next are those recommendations and how we arrived at it and really weaned down a list of 100 to 5 particular strategies with some additional content built out for each one. Before I do that, I want to just pause and introduce 2 key questions that I hope you all will consider as we walk through the recommendations. The first one is, are we appropriately addressing priority topics for climate resilient land use in these recommendations? We'll talk about some sort of key big nodes, how we started to organize and categorize the 100 different strategies into topics. Are there some that we're missing that we really need to pull up into these priority recommendations? And then second, this is really where I want to lean in, especially in conversation with you all, are there other opportunities to update the wetlands regulations and promote climate resilience? As we walk through this and the process of identifying those priority recommendations. I think something I've acknowledged and recognized is that there is not a heavy presence of those regulations in the final set of the initial set of recommendations. And so I'm curious, are there things that you know of because of your experience having to implement and administer these regulations that we really should be bringing up into this work? I think in our core team meeting last time, Judy brought up a great point that there are some hidden protections in wetlands that could be strengthened for climate resilience, and I think she's totally spot on. So I'd love your help to figure out what those are and what can we lean into and continue to develop through the remaining few months of the project. Okay, so here's the first thing that we did. From that list of 100 different strategies, we organized them into different nodes so that progress could be considered and coordinated across the different bylaws and regulations, and messaging can be more strategic and holistic. So we're thinking them sort of as packages and bundles, but we're also not losing some of the detail and expansiveness of the matrix. These nodes aren't perfect, but at a high level, they are helping us figure our way through and navigate a lot of ideas into something that's more organized. So let's see, there are 14, I think, different nodes of organization of the specific strategies. Okay, so from there, once we had these nodes of organized strategies, we then looked at all of them and said, how much do they align with those guiding principles that the core team developed? And those guiding principles were centering the lived experience of people who live, work, and play in Hopkinton, really focusing on accessibility and equity, being excellent stewards for local resources, prioritizing ecosystem benefits, building connections and conversations and multi-solving solutions, interdependence across land use and property ownership lines, and then striving towards really tangible impacts as material change matters for demonstrating outcomes and progress. So the next step was to rank each of those nodes in terms of its alignment with those guiding principles. And what you'll see here was our first cut at doing that. I think, again, it's imperfect, but it was an attempt to try to figure out where is there the most alignment and most impact that achieves the overarching guiding principles that the core team established. We used a scoring system of 1 to 3, the 3, that darker green, meaning more alignment, the 1 meaning less alignment. And you can see we ended up with some higher scoring strategy nodes at the end of the exercise. And that is what led us to start to hone in on 5 priority recommendations. So this is where we were landing. And I'll just walk through each of these again and at a very high level. I'll note that in the report I sent, there's more information that I think gives a better sense of how we're understanding and contextualizing and recommending progress for each of these priority recommendations. We note sort of first steps, additional considerations, what's the resilience impact of this recommendation, how will it be implemented, who are the partners to implement the recommendation, and then we reference and define a few examples or case studies from around the state that the town could look at should it choose to pursue that specific recommendation. So the first recommendation is to leverage regulatory tools to support climate resilience through updates to general purpose statements and language. This is the idea that the town of Hopkinton should really begin by updating those general purpose statements to acknowledge climate impacts and risks, as well as connections between development practices and climate resilience. General purpose statements can set an overarching framework for subsequent updates to specific provisions. So we felt like this is a really solid and important place to start. The second recommendation is to expand and enhance the scope of environmental analysis to protect soil ecosystems and promote ecosystem services in subdivision developments. So while informative in its existing condition, the environmental analysis, which is part of the definitive plan for subdivisions, would benefit from an expanded scope and a more robust scope to consider additional pre-development conditions and post-development impacts that might include but aren't limited to surface and groundwater quality, urban heat island, cumulative and secondary impacts, municipal benefits or costs, and air quality. And there are examples of some communities in the state who have really done this in a very extensive way. It's just thinking about how to operationalize it and ensure that the planning board is ready to receive that information and make a decision upon it. The third recommendation is to explore the use of special zoning districts or overlays to address climate risks, protect critical ecosystems, and promote housing density in specific areas based on further research and study and guidance from the community. The bylaw review and prioritization matrix identified 3 potential overlay districts for additional study, and these are noted in the report with more explanation. A housing overlay district, a high ecosystem carbon overlay district, and then specific amendments for the existing floodplain district. For each, the zoning advisory committee, who might take this recommendation and put it into practice, should really complete, as I mentioned, a more thorough and deliberate process to review relevant precedents, define the boundaries of a district, and then assess possible zoning mechanisms for enforcing or guiding that land use. The 4th recommendation, we're almost there, is to promote and protect natural features and vegetation in development and site standards, site design standards for Hopkinton's open space and land preservation development bylaw. There's also a connection, I think, an opportunity here to really focus on existing tree protection and preservation standards, which Judy raised in our last meeting, and I'm really grateful to you for doing that. Recognizing the significance of trees in retention and detention of stormwater, as well as reducing and controlling sedimentation and some other co-benefits, including clean air, mitigation of heat islands, reduction of noise pollution. Is there a way that we can start to think about how we enhance and strengthen tree protections within some of these existing bylaws, and also design and plan in a way that accommodates natural features? So it might be worth thinking about alternative approaches to develop a tree protection ordinance for some standardization based on some different models across the state. And then the last priority is priority 5, encouraging adoption of low impact development and green infrastructure techniques, especially in commercial and industrial districts, and thinking about are there financial or regulatory incentives that can be used to encourage that type of work. I think we mentioned this earlier, that this is an area of strength with strategic opportunities for more expansive impact. And Hopkinton could start by considering low impact development and green infrastructure incentives, specifically in commercial and industrial development and business and downtown business districts to offset some of the impervious surfaces that exist. Possible incentives to consider might include expediting permitting timeframes, reducing permitting fees, offering density bonuses or relaxed frontage requirements. There are a lot of other tools that are also available for the municipality to consider that can be impactful to developers and help them integrate some of these preferred techniques. I am feeling tired talking, so I'm going to pause and would love to first see if there are any questions from you all for clarity, but then would really appreciate maybe a round robin for folks who are here today to talk about are there priority topics that are missing based on maybe those nodes, or another way that you're thinking about climate resilience land use? And then to lean in especially to how can wetland protections be strengthened to promote climate resilience through this project? I'm really curious if there are areas that we have missed that you think are important, like expanded buffer zone jurisdictions, expanding isolated land subject to flooding definitions, integrating green infrastructure in a specific way, maybe offering landscape requirements or planting plans within the wetlands regulation. We've also seen treatment of topsoil, erosion and sediment control. Like, what else is out there? What have you learned or identified through your experience that maybe we should be thinking about in our process of finalizing and developing these recommendations? Awesome. I'm happy to continue sharing my screen, but if it helps everyone to see each other to have a conversation, I can also stop. So let me know your preference, but thank you for listening. Thanks for being a part of this effort. We've also been presenting to Sustainable Green Committee, Planning Board. We're hoping to meet with Chamber of Commerce. So really shopping around and socializing this work to groups of people who either would help implement or be affected by the recommendations. Thanks, Zoe, for dropping that in the chat. Great.
I don't really feel like I'm chairing the meeting, but I did start us. Let's see. I would prefer to see more faces.
Great.
And if you have more slides, we
I'll
can
just
always
bring it
pop
back up. You got it.
And I guess I'll start with this. I don't know where else you can look, but I'm very interested. I've been on the zoning advisory committee for a while. We haven't met in a long
great.
time.
Yep.
And it's about time I got together with John and we figure out when our next meeting ought to be. But I was very interested in building a tree protection bylaw, which we don't have. And I got stuck very quickly because I just don't know enough about trees. I don't know enough about how other towns are doing it. I didn't find enough examples. I found in Wellesley a very, 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 very strict law that I never ever thought would pass here in Hopkinton. So I'm curious in that world, what else have you guys seen? And I would be very interested once our meeting's done and you find some time, if you could send me more information about what other towns are doing. But conversationally, can you help me out with what you're seeing other towns doing with tree protection and how it passed their town meetings and how people didn't feel like their own property rights were being trampled on, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate you sharing this. And I'll mention a couple of things. First, in conversations with John, he's raised the role that the zoning advisory committee will play in starting to develop the language for any of these recommendations moving forward. So just to note that I think you all will be circled in at the appropriate time and appreciate that role that you may play. I'm glad you bring up tree protection ordinance, and that's something that Judy raised as well. There's several examples, and I'll name them here, and then MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, has a really nice online resource where they mention specific examples of communities that have done exemplary or maybe that better practice around tree protections, knowing that trees can play a really important role in mitigating heat and flooding.
Could you just tell me what that site is again, that organization?
Yeah, it's the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you.
Yeah. And some of the examples that they share are, and why don't we do this, Ted? I'll say it here and then I'll put it in an email or whatever is the best way I can work through Judy to get you information in a way that respects the public process that you all have. They share examples from Braintree, Dedham, I think Norwood, Dover, Wenham. They might have included Wellesley as well. But there are a couple different things that they highlight, including tree replacement ratios. So just looking at what that might be in different buffer areas and resource areas, as well as the minimum DBH for determining whether a tree can be removed or not, or what the ratio of replacement is. I think Hopkinton is 10 and some communities use 6. Like that itself is a process. Judy, you might know this off the top of your head as well. So looking through some of those levers, I think could be a way to revisit it. And I would be curious as well if there are other sticking points. I think just to get us a step ahead a little bit, we will be hosting community open house at the end of July, which will be an opportunity to bring both Conservation Commission members, Sustainable Green Committee, Planning Board, as well as the members of the public together to talk through these recommendations and address some of those common concerns, because what you shared is these are points of resistance or tensions that have come up, can be anticipated, and there are ways to think about them and consider them in the development of any ordinance. So that'll be a chance to really work through what are the challenges that might exist, what do you need in order to implement it, and like what are the overtures that we tend to hear, and how do we consider that in the development of the recommendation itself. So those are, to answer your question, that's sort of at a high level, and you can share this resource that has links to each of the bylaws or regulations and a nice summary of the change that they've made within the regulation itself.
Thank you. That gets me started. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah.
If I can follow on Ted.
Great.
As the major league tree hugger. The other day, I found myself on Chamberlain and I had some time and I drove down Chamberlain to the new part. And it was like going from a lovely wooded to a desert. And if those of you on the Concom who haven't been down Chamberlain of late, it is hardly a stick. It is bereft of anything that looks like a unique life form. And how the planning board and how this could have managed to salvage or save some of those trees. I have no idea. The other thing I want to mention, and I'm sorry that I don't remember exactly, but Sudbury Valley trustees and another organization have a fabulous internet available tool that looks at I'm going to say the value of property. And it does it in like 10-foot squares or 30-foot squares. I forget the number. It is an amazing tool that looks at what's there and rates it on a variety of measures. And I think it's something you surely should have a gander at. And I'll shut up for the moment. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Ed. Yeah, it's helpful to hear what tools are out there. I think something we're holding is many of these changes can affect and improve property values, and it is important to make sure that it is still affordable and people are able to live in Hopkinton. So how do we balance development with some of these conservation priorities and tree protections is like top on our radar screen. So I appreciate that as a tool for understanding part of this calculation and approach to the work.
Sorry, I'm back.
Okay.
Tree protection. So we changed insurance companies because our homeowners insurance company, which we've had for 40 years, came along and said that tree in your front yard has to go. And I've talked to people I know in the tree business, and they said that they are doing quite well because insurance companies are telling people that their trees have to go. And rather than being obstinate like us, they just acquiesce and do what the insurance company tells them.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful to hear. Part of what we want to do through the community open house is get a sense of what is the experience of folks who live there. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I'm curious, Melissa or Matt, I know we haven't heard from you. Any thoughts on, we've heard about sort of tree protection. Are there other parts of the wetlands regulation that really we could be focusing on or strengthening through this work? What stands out to you, or any thoughts on that?
My thoughts would be within our regulations,
Yeah.
we stumble upon a lot of cases where we're trying to look back at precedent. And so maybe some standards within our regulation, like you're talking about for removing trees, what should we be doing in the buffer? The buffer is very, at our discretion. And what does that mean? And it's hard to be at our discretion and hold that and still, have that flexibility to work with landowners, but protect the wetland with, our 100-foot buffer. So I think that also, like you said, Ed, I go up off of Blueberry, and it's the same thing. They cut everything. It's just, I don't know, being able to, you talk a lot about in your report about maintaining trees, maintaining, the natural features, maintaining what you can, and how can we get more of that into our regulation and help support that. Yeah.
Okay.
Because that's where we see the problems with the development happen.
Great. That's so helpful. And if you don't mind, I'd love to ask a follow-up question and welcome others to add to if they want. I think this conundrum that you bring up about having flexibility to be able to work with a developer or a proposal and also having a precedent on which to make a decision is a really interesting gray space to be working in, especially in those buffer zone jurisdictions. And I would love to hear what would be helpful, what would the ideal outcome, or what would exemplary, doesn't have to be the exact language, but where would you like to be positioned, or what would you like to have in order to make that type of decision or have the best conversation? Curious, as you use these and work with them over time, what would be most useful?
I'd throw out one thing that I think we're absolutely lacking in writing at the moment is mitigation and what that means. I think it would go a long way in helping everyone understand, both applicants, landowners, and the commission, to have some baseline, right? What does it mean for mitigation along the lakefront? What does it mean for mitigation for work within the 50-foot buffer, the 100-foot buffer? what are our baseline expectations of an applicant if they want to remove vegetation in those areas? Because right now we're just, as Melissa said, we're just kind of going on a case by case basis and using our judgment, which is fine.
Mhm.
There's nothing wrong with that, but I think it helps set the stage if we have some language that provides a framework for everyone.
Great. I totally agree. And if I can push you, Matt, and feel free to say, I'm not ready to answer that question. In your mind, is there a way that you would define mitigation and what that means to you or what that means to the Concom based on your experience?
That's a great question. I think from what I've seen in my short time on the commission, the lakefront is a priority area.
Mhm.
And I think what needs to be done there in that first 25 feet should be more substantial than what we may ask for work in a 50-foot buffer,
Okay.
for like an inland resource.
Mhm.
I've seen in general, on projects I've worked on myself, right, 2-to-1 for tree loss, 4-to-1 for shrubs.
Yeah.
I don't think either of those necessarily gets us where we want to be on the lakefront. So I think that's, I don't know that we've ever really put a number to it.
Mhm.
But as we've seen residents come in for development along the lakefront where it's been, grass right up to the wall or grass right up to the bank, we've really pushed to have more of a buffer strip. So it may not be a quantity of plantings, it may be an area of plantings.
Yep. Oh, great. Does anybody else want to add on to this, to what Matt is sharing? I think this is a really great line of thinking that's helpful to explore. So if folks have additional thoughts, would love to hear.
Yeah, no, I would just echo what Matt was saying. The lake front is definitely a hot topic for us and something that we're trying to work with people on. So establishing some standards for that buffer, lakefront buffer, water buffer, which is different than, what we would expect in the buffer of, a wetland necessarily. So, yeah.
And if I can stick in here, I live on Lake Whitehall, and
Yeah.
I've seen the impact of subdivisions in the watershed, not on the lakefront, but in the watershed, and the very detrimental effect that the runoff from those subdivisions have had on the lake. So I think that that thought needs to be expanded beyond just the lakefront.
Sure. And I think hopefully many of the recommendations and strategies really focus on the subdivision regulations so that there's strengthening happening in multiple places. So I think our ideal outcome is that we are working on a couple of fronts here to what you've just raised, Ed. Ted, I know you started us off. Would love to circle back and see if there's anything you want to add here around those buffers or lakefront work. Yeah.
No, I am completely the Lake Maspinock homeowners pushing their grass and their decks and their fire pits right to the lakefront is maddening to me. And we don't have any hard and fast rules. And we're kind of every meeting it's when we have a new applicant, there's a line like, in recent years, we have been pushing lakefront owners to do this. And it would be wonderful to have something written down in the bylaws that requires this, not just pushing. The other topic I was going to bring up,
Great.
on Zach, our discussion of tree protection started years ago as a two-pronged push to try to limit solar development. In recent years, we did pass through town meeting much stronger regulations with solar development and screening and the amount of trees between homes and sight lines from 400 yards away and things like that. And I don't know if that has slowed solar development in town or if just the best pieces of property got developed. But the tree protection bylaw was going to be kind of a second angle into trying to control a little bit better solar development. So when I think of the Chamberlain Wayland development and the amount of trees that are chopped down, we might be able to do some things to say you must plant trees in the yards, you must replace them. I don't know how to do that with solar development because you can't have solar farms with trees between the solar panels. But I am worried about more solar development in town, even though we haven't had much for a while. maybe this is less Conservation Commission than it is me on my ZAC planning board side, but more help with solar farms in town. If we get more applicants coming in, I would appreciate.
Okay, I appreciate you sharing that. Thanks for offering that. And I guess my initial thought is the motivation behind updating the bylaws and regulations through our charge is really focused on climate resilience. And I think that is a different reason for which to have a tree protection ordinance. And so it will probably be the work of the ZAC to figure out, if you decide
Okay.
to move forward with this as a recommendation, how are those interacting? Because we are just, that is outside of our scope. We're just going to focus
Okay.
on what is the role that trees can play in mitigating heat and flooding. And because
Okay.
of that, what could the zoning advisory committee do, and what could a tree ordinance achieve? And
Okay.
if it feels like that is a value of the community as you go through that process, maybe you might bring a different lens into the development of language or the consideration and standards or any sort of
Yeah.
components of that regulation. But just to raise that as
Sure.
helpful to hear that was part of the rationale. And I think we are going to focus on it through a specific lens, which doesn't mean as it moves along, it won't further consider some other things that are coming up
Sure.
in town.
I have
Yeah.
a question, or if you're done, Ted, when you're done.
No, I was just going to say conversationally then, I
Great.
believe in renewable energy, and I believe in solar as a cure to the problems that we're facing. But I also believe that there are places for solar development, and there are places where maybe we should not be looking for solar development. And the state has all sorts of laws in place to encourage development of solar energy. And I just feel like some of that is somewhat short-sighted and damaging to communities. And if we could encourage more rooftop solar and parking lot solar and things like that. But again, that's conversational outside of what your job is.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for naming it. Ed, I saw you raise a finger. I want to also note that Melissa had a question. Is your thought connected to this?
It's just connected to protecting trees and natural features.
Bring it on. Let's go.
I was just curious if you have ever seen any incentives that could be put into place for protecting pieces of land as developers are doing their designs. I mean, obviously, they're just cutting down all these trees to do the development because that's cheaper, right? They bring them in and it just makes everything easier. So have you seen any incentives like to counteract that and like encourage them to maintain more stands of trees, or not really?
This is a really interesting question. I think what it will push us to do, we've seen incentives for the integration of green infrastructure into proposed development. I don't know, and that's Devon's has done a really good job of that. I don't know if I've seen incentives for tree protection, but I think I'll take this as a bit of like a research question to run with and see if there are examples out there, because I imagine we could figure out if it could be written in such a way that it incentivizes green infrastructure and tree protection at the same time, with guidance that allows it to be actionable or can be implemented by the developer. So I'm glad you raised this, Melissa. I think it's something we can continue to explore and noodle on. And yeah, it's running my gears about are there, based on, or like even using what's in place for green infrastructure as a model, could that be adapted for tree protection if there's a tree protection ordinance that makes it less of a stick and more of a carrot to make that type of change in the design. So it's a
Yeah, to me, that sounds like more of like our open space bylaw that it creates the smaller lots and then sets aside a specific amount of open space as protected land. The other thing that I was thinking of too is, just kind of from a staff perspective, but I see the commission's frustration is, we get applicants that on paper meet our regulations for no build zones, but realistically, we know that, having the house touching the no build zone, that we're going to get the request for the tree that's going to fall on my house. That's, now you're going to, harm my family and harm my property if you don't let me cut these trees. And, so it's hard when you get something on paper that everybody's like, well, it meets all your regulations, so approve
Right.
it. When realistically, we know that that's not. So, how to help the commission be able, we don't want to, deny projects, but it's hard when on paper they meet our regulations, but we know realistically it's not going to how it's going to be in the long run, kind of thing.
Anna, will you explain that? Like, will you give an example or explain a scenario again of where you've seen that happen, just so I can make sure we can then act within. Here's something that they've faced where they've approved because it meets all the regulations. But if they were written in such a different way that there could be something to lean upon, would love to hear an example of that.
Absolutely. So where you have, most of our single family house lots have, a
Yep.
50-foot no build. So,
Yep.
can I put my house right on the 50-foot? But then, I want as big a lawn as possible. And so we try to minimize amount of lawn in the buffer zone, especially if the house is already, into that buffer zone. So then, like, what's the minimums? But then, all of a sudden these lawns are getting bigger and bigger. And if you have a small lawn, but then you have your trees, within 10 or 15 feet of the house, and, as soon as you clear it, all of a sudden now you have 60, 70-foot trees within 10 or 15 feet of your house. So are you damaging root systems when you're, grading, excavating? And then, because of climate change, we're seeing stronger storms, bigger storms.
Right.
And, we're seeing, trees fall on houses. And then, okay, well, this one tree fell. Now I want all the trees within 50 feet or 60 feet or 70 feet of my house to be cleared. So, we get a lot of that. Well, the developer was allowed to put the house there by meeting our regulations. But, what can the commission do to, obviously still allow development? These people have a right to develop their property, but be able to do our job of protecting, the resource areas. And, what's that balance there?
We'll do our best to solve that question. I think this is the question of our time. So I appreciate you raising that, Anna, and giving the example, and recognizing how it sits within the changing climate that we're going to start to see these impacts in more intense ways. I'm noticing the time, 12:53. We have about 7 minutes left. I have 2 slides. So I think I would love, and Judy, feel free to jump into, I know other folks have taken the mic, and you've sat with this information now for maybe a month since our first presentation. Now you're hearing it again with some other perspectives. If there's any light bulbs that are going off for you, things that are coming to mind, detail that would be helpful to operationalize. Yeah, would love some thoughts from you. And then I might do another round robin of like burning ideas or questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. No, I definitely echo what everyone's been saying. Maybe the only
Cool.
thing I'm not hearing a ton about is with stormwater, we don't have a lot of bite when it comes to what kinds of stormwater improvements get, proposed and implemented in projects. So, maybe we can do something with the regulations around encouraging green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, at least in buffer zone. I think that could be a great start to seeing more of that in town, encouraging other folks to do it voluntarily, since we do have that kind of limited area of influence. But
Right.
I think that's just one thing that I wasn't hearing too much about.
Awesome. Thanks for raising it, Judy. I appreciate it. And I think it's something that I believe it might, you all know it best, but it's like encourage, but doesn't require. So are there changes in language that we can make to really enhance and improve what's happening in those buffer zones? Wetland protection areas. Okay, I'm going to share my screen set up again for the last 2 slides. And Zoe, anything that I've missed that you feel is really important to share at this point?
I think we haven't missed anything, but I know there's that question of tree protection ordinance versus like guidelines or things that are for private landowners in terms of their lawn care practices or their own. And I wondered if we wanted to take any time to try to grapple with that.
So thinking about maybe the regulatory and non-regulatory work areas for improvement. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm glad you flagged it. Let's go through these slides. If we don't get to it today, I think that's a great idea for the open house that we can talk through at one of the stations. So thanks for sharing. Okay, let's share the screen again.
Lucy,
Yeah,
I don't want to take up much time at all, but one thing occurred to me.
okay, go for it.
I get worried when we have water crossings and then road salt being used on those bridges with water crossings,
Mhm.
and where that salt goes to, especially if it's not an isolated wetland, but a stream running through a whole system. And I don't know if there's more regulations we can have around that or not. We haven't had one of those cases for a while, but every time we do, I get a little worried about the salt that is going to be used.
Yeah,
So
okay.
If I can
We-
step in, I have firsthand experience and it's not as bad as you think. And I don't want to take up time to explain that. We can talk about it later.
Okay, thanks. Thanks both of you for jumping in there. Okay, sharing my screen here. This is just a quick review of where where we've been up to what we're grappling with now, and this is where we're headed. So we're doing these like implementation partner roundtables, having conversation, as I mentioned, with folks who will be helpful or have a role in administering any updates June through this month. In July, and I can pull up the date, it'll be July, I think it's the 24th at 5:30 in the evening at the library. We're going to have a community open house, which is really another opportunity to, again, orient to the recommendations, but have conversations with us and the staff about how might these be implemented. What are some challenges we could face in developing and moving through recommended new language? How can we strategize around that? And what experiences can you bring from sort of continuing this conversation from reviewing projects that can help us really refine and tweak those recommendations? And the hope is that we'll engage some folks in that conversation who might not have been at these roundtables already. In August, we'll then update the final report and make some changes and bring that back to the core team for them to review. And then in September, the hope is we will have a final report that incorporates those last revisions and input from a final ranking of what do we really want to prioritize here. And that will be presented to the select board in September. So that's where we're headed. And here's your save the date for July 24th, as I mentioned, 5:30 to 7:30 at the library. Food will be provided. We might do some myth busting. We might change that framing a little bit, but just really thinking about how can you all then start to talk to your networks and neighbors about some of these common concerns, and also help us really build a readiness and openness and awareness of some of the changes that could be coming, sort of grease those wheels for some updates over time. So we'll hope you'll join us and join some of the other boards and commissions and also community members at that meeting. With that, I'm going to stop. I know we're up to time. I'll just say thank you so much for having a really engaged discussion. Thank you, Judy and Anna, for organizing and for being part of that discussion. And thanks to all of you for being here. Ed, I see your hand, so we'll be sure to get to you. But really appreciate the time, and we'll follow up. I know I'll follow up, Ted, with that link to the MAPC website, and anything else, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll share my email with Judy, and I think you might have it already, but feel free to send an email or give a call if you have a thought or an idea. We can finish or however you want, but
Okay.
and Ed, I'm happy to hang on if that's helpful.
Ed, what do you got?
I want to talk about invasives and where invasives fit into what you are doing. This town is being overrun with them.
Mhm.
Consequences are going to be bigger than we're thinking about, and I don't hear it in what you're talking about. The other thing is of interest, I don't think it fits in necessarily as night lighting, and now I really will shut up.
Okay, I appreciate it. I think the thing we've been trying to work in, and it may not be in those priority recommendations, but if you look through the full matrix, and that will be a tool for the town to have moving forward. But promoting planting of native species and climate tolerant plants that could then minimize the need for some of the regular mowing, trimming, irrigation, fertilizer. That's on our radar. I don't think we deal as directly with what to do with invasives through the regulations, but how can the regulations be used to promote native plantings and native species? So that's how we're thinking about it now. Would be happy to continue a conversation if there's some ideas about other approaches that we can take. But that's definitely on our radar through that lens.
Are there any other comments for Lucy or Zoe? Questions other than thank yous? I will say a big, big thank you for everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you for all you're doing and will continue to do.
Great.
Is there anything else there? Then I'm going to ask really quickly before I get a roll call to end the meeting. Are we at the farmer's market this weekend? Now that I'm in the summer, I promised I would be much more available in the summertime for these things.
So not this weekend. Next one is July 6th.
July
I'll
6th.
send out an email next week to see who's available.
Okay, that'll be great.
And I've been tasked with this already by another member, and I have noted that I am available and put it on my calendar for the 6th.
So
Okay, I may be able to join you, Ed. It'll be a nice hangout. You can tell me about salt going into streams. Is there anything else?
I was shocked at what I learned and saw.
Really? Okay.
Positive.
All right, then I guess I'm looking for a motion to adjourn and a second to that motion.
I'll make that motion.
I'll do a second.
Great, let's do a roll call vote. Ed,
Aye.
Melissa,
Hi.
Matthew,
Aye.
Ted is an aye. That's the end of this meeting. I'll see a couple of you in a couple hours.
That's good. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Lucy and Zoe.
Thank you.
You.
Bye, thanks.
I'm sorry my Bates couple weren't here to see you, but I'll pass the word.
Appreciate it.
Always fun to discover connections.
Yeah, have a good one.